we'll get right into it as far as the questions. If you could go back in time, what's a vote you'd reverse and why?
What's a vote I would reverse? Ooh. I voted for the Farm Bill. I have revisited on occasion my concerns about it still. There were good reasons to support it, including the manner in which cow-calf operations were treated, since that is a huge component of Wyoming agriculture. I supported it because of the way the sugar beet industry was treated. I supported it because it did end direct payments to farmers and ranchers, which I think is a step in the right direction. It did not do a good job, I believe, of reforming nutrition programs like SNAP, which is food stamps, and still makes up 80% of the Farm Bill. Calling it a Farm Bill is a misnomer, because really it's 80% mandatory spending or food stamps. And unless we reform our entitlement and mandatory spending in ways that will change the trajectory of our debt and deficit, we're not going to be able to change the trajectory of our debt and deficit. So I do regret the part of the Farm Bill that didn't adequately reform SNAP. That being said, as you can see, I was two minds about the Farm Bill.
It's no secret that Washington politics are very polarized. Would you consider yourself part of that problem? If so, how? And if not, why not?
I believe the biggest problem is the fact that Harry Reid, and Harry Reid alone, is sitting on 358 House-passed bills, many of which were passed on a bipartisan basis. So when you have one person and one person only blocking that much legislation, think about it. That's like a bill a day for an entire year that Harry Reid will not even assign to a committee in the Senate to allow it to be considered, have a hearing on it, have amendments, and allow it to get to the floor. It makes us look more polarized than we really are. Now, if the Senate becomes Republican, and you had a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and we're still polarized and unable to get legislation to the president's desk, then I will claim some responsibility for that. But right now, I lay it on the doorstep of Harry Reid.
Let's talk about the federal debt ceiling. You've seen members of the House, including yourself, support taking that to the brink. Would you do so in the future, and how do you justify your votes on that?
On raising the debt ceiling?
Mm-hmm.
If we didn't raise the debt ceiling, while the Democrats control the White House and the Senate, we would be in a position where the country could, over a period of months, choose to default on its debt because the Treasury Secretary has said that he will not prioritize the manner in which payments are made. Now, if you had a Secretary of the Treasury who was willing to pay interest on the national debt prior to paying other bills, we could slow the trajectory of the debt ceiling. But this administration is bound and determined to put politics, in my opinion, ahead of good policy. So if Congress were in a position where they could actually work with the administration, we would be able to have a Treasury Secretary who could work with us and say, okay, I'm willing to pay interest on the national debt before all other obligations of government. quite frankly, both parties share some guilt here because the Republicans will not raise taxes. The Democrats will not cut spending. And so they're enablers of each other to just raise the debt ceiling, which just is a tax on the next generation. So what we should be doing is reforming our entitlement programs, reforming our mandatory spending programs, and as I believe the Republican candidate for president chose to do 2 years ago, he acknowledged that we were going to have to raise some user fees in order to make it cash flow. Now, I have voted for budgets that would balance in 10 years and in 4 years. The Paul Ryan budget, put out by the Budget Committee chairman, will balance in 10 years. The Republican Study Committee budget would balance in 4 years. If the Congress would pass those budgets, we wouldn't have to raise the debt ceiling anymore. But the Senate won't pass those budgets. So that was why we passed no budget, no pay in the House, because the Senate wouldn't pass a budget. So to quite frankly, provoke the Senate to passing a budget, we passed no budget, no pay. Finally, that broke the logjam. Patty Murray came to the table, met with Paul Ryan. They hammered out a budget. It did blow through the Budget Control Act's spending caps, but only to the tune of about $25 billion for military and about $19 billion for non-military discretionary spending. So we went from a budget under the Budget Control Act that was about $950 to $960 billion to $1,014 billion. Now, I did not support that budget, and I did not support raising the debt ceiling the last time it was brought up. So I have a record of opposing some debt ceiling increases, supporting others. And until we get through the situation where there's this standoff between Republicans and Democrats, where Democrats will not cut spending, Republicans will not raise taxes, we're in a tough spot.
So what are you doing to get us through that situation?
Well, I support, as I said, the House budget, the Paul Ryan budget, that if we would adopt it, would finally eliminate the deficit over 10 years, and the Republican Study Committee budget, which would eliminate the deficit in 4 years. So let's say the Senate would adopt the Republican Study Committee budget, and the president would sign it. And we could begin to operate under that budget. After 4 years, we then could be in a surplus position where we could start paying down the national debt. And if we could get to that point, then the economy would start growing again, and we believe that it would reduce the debt even faster. So that is the motivation for having a budget that balances and proving to the American people that it can be done.
How would you describe the size of your campaign effort, and what does the size of your campaign say about how seriously you're taking your challenger?
Well, I have, as always, a formal campaign. I have a campaign manager. We're putting up signs around the state. I have not thus far had an aggressive media campaign in the primary, paid media campaign, because quite frankly, there are other races in the state that are so competitive, like the Secretary of State's race, the governor's race, the superintendent of public instruction's race, and it's so active in the Republican primary for those races that I have decided to keep my powder dry in terms of a lot of paid media in the primary in order to allow those more competitive races to flesh out. In other words, I think my message would be drowned out if I was using paid media in the primary by those more competitive multi-candidate races. Nevertheless, I'm campaigning aggressively around the state. I've visited multiple counties, just came from a tour of a local business. Yesterday I was in Riverton. The day before that I was in Lincoln County at the county fair. I was in Teton County over the weekend at the Jackson Hole Land Trust. So I'm leaving from here to go to the State Fair in Douglas and to speak to the cattlemen's. And then I'll be back at the State Fair over the weekend, up to Sheridan this weekend. So I'm doing a typical road trip campaign around Wyoming, connecting with the people of Wyoming and listening to them.
Who would you consider your chief supporters?
My chief supporters? I think that regular Wyoming people who are hardworking taxpayers, who are working for a living and trying to make ends meet in a situation where the EPA is driving up the cost of electricity, which drives up the cost of food, which drives up the cost of gasoline. And the fact that our businesses, the Wyoming's core businesses, are under attack and pressure is put on them by the EPA and by federal regulations, it's driving up their cost of living. For a lot of people, their health insurance costs go up. So if you look at your typical Wyoming resident and how all of those daily expenses of life have gone up, and they're just trying to make ends meet, they're getting squeezed. And I'd like to believe that that is my typical supporter, because I recognize that when the federal government closes off or reduces the amount of oil and gas drilling on federal lands, when they pass greenhouse gas regulations that are the most expensive regulations in the history of humankind, and that is going to raise the cost of electricity for every Wyoming resident, that they understand the connection between the two. So I'd like to believe that that is my typical supporter.
So let's talk about the EPA. What role should the EPA play, and do you think it's fulfilling that role?
I think the EPA is behaving in a very heavy-handed manner in terms of the way it's interpreting the law, the way it's creating rules and regulation that stretch or break the bounds of the law. There have been numerous cases where EPA regulations have been found, even within the District of Columbia federal court circuit, to be overreaching. When it comes to waters of the U.S. regulations, trying to gain control over all of America's waters. In fact, the arrogance of saying waters of the U.S. Is implying that the water belongs to the United States government. It does not. It's very clear that water is the province of states. States have been regulating water well, and their grab of that resource is unprecedented and unwarranted. The Forest Service has regulations that would treat groundwater the same as surface water and reach into state regulations and take it over. That's wrong. They have defined agricultural exemptions in such a way that you can't tell what's an exemption. They have defined milk spilling on a road as a hazardous material spill. They have defined certain power plants like the Neil Simpson unit at Wyodak in Gillette, shutting it down 10 years before its useful life has expired because of what they believe will be rescuing the planet from climate change that is going to raise the oceans. We had testimony in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee by a former Department of Energy employee that said, if you take out a dime and look at the width of a dime, that's how much the oceans will rise as a result of coal-powered energy. These regulations are regulations for regulation's sake. They are not regulations for the purpose of saving the planet or improving the environment. Look at the standards for particulate matter. Regional haze has nothing to do with air quality. It has to do with the quality of what you see, the vision. It is ludicrous, the reach. They're reaching now through your electrical wiring to regulate what's going to go on at your thermostat in your house. That should be beyond the reach of the federal government. The EPA's overreach is the most egregious in the federal government, and that is really saying something.
Let's talk about the committees and subcommittees that you're on. Which seat would you consider most useful for Wyoming, and what seat would you rather have?
Like on a committee? Mm-hmm. Well, right now I'm looking at the possibility of, since Doc Hastings is retiring from Congress, he is the current chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. I suspect that Rob Bishop of Utah will become the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. Rob would be vacating the subcommittee chairmanship of the Public Lands Subcommittee within the Natural Resources Committee. I will be contending for and asked to become the subcommittee chairman of the Public Lands Subcommittee of the House Natural Resources Committee.
And how would you consider that more valuable?
The amount of public lands in the West, the activities on our public lands are so pivotal to the manner in which Wyoming is able to garner revenue as a state. The stewardship that we provide, the fact that I used to be on the state's Board of Land Commissioners and spent a little stint as the director of the Office of State Lands and Investments. I've had the opportunity to see how much better the stewardship is in many cases on state land than it is on public land or federal land, especially when it comes to forest health. We've seen that throughout the region, even in Colorado, where you can see examples of state land that is managed with federal land around it. And because it was well managed, the state land does not have bark beetle infestations, and the surrounding federal land has basically been denuded of lodgepole pine. The same is true with the Black Hills. There are perfect examples of where selective harvesting has produced a much healthier stand of trees. So because I have seen marvelous stewardship on state land in comparison to the manner in which some of our federal lands are administered, I would like to take what I learned as a member of the State Board of Land Commissioners, and I've been looking at since, and incorporate some of those philosophies into consideration as the subcommittee chairman of the Public Lands Subcommittee.
Let's talk about energy exports of coal and natural gas. What are you doing to help Wyoming products make it to foreign customers, and what else could you do?
Well, I met with the now new Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. India is a country that would very much like to come into the second and first world with regard to energy, and energy is the only way that they can do it. I have visited him when he was the governor of Gujarat province. In Gujarat, there are Tata Motors and Ford Motor Company have facilities to manufacture automobiles that feed off and need energy. And if India is to emerge from, in many areas of India being a third world country, they need energy. We talked about natural gas, which currently you cannot import export to from the United States to India. We also need to take advantage of the fact that Russia has become in a position that emboldens it politically and aggressively in Europe, which is even a more promising market for LNG, and so they'll have an alternative source of energy, so they're not so dependent on Russia. These are, and of course, in the case of coal, we're working with railroads to try to break through barriers to get our coal to the West Coast so it can be exported to China. So those are the avenues that I see as very promising. Probably with regard to natural gas, I think the more promising avenue for export is into the Gulf of Mexico, whereas coal, it does seem to be more advantageous to go to the West Coast of the United States or the West Coast of Canada.
What legislation have you sponsored that's taken a strong stance against federal regulatory encroachment that has actually become law?
There is a Trona royalty provision where the export of Trona, soda ash from Wyoming, is so pivotal to keeping a robust soda ash industry, particularly in southwest Wyoming. When the royalty went from 2% back up to 6%, our natural soda ash becomes uncompetitive with China's subsidized manufactured soda ash. It is artificial. So in order to keep our internationally competitive environment, I was able to push for a 4% royalty. We were unable to successfully convince the Congress to go back to the 2%, but at 4% we're still more competitive than we were at a royalty for 6%, and that has become law.
Any questions? Just want to give you chances to make a closing statement, and partly kind of the framework we're looking at there is why we should vote for you instead of Jason Sackman.
Very good. Well, I thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I worked for the last year with Doc Hastings on a working group to identify the areas of reform of the Endangered Species Act that we could most successfully pass on a bipartisan basis. And in fact, we did get it past the House. Now, I don't know that the Senate will consider it. Obviously, I've already mentioned that Harry Reid has 358 bills piled up on his lap. But we passed some reforms that really would be meaningful, and the eastern states are now going to face because of the long-eared bat that may be listed and will have a transformative effect on the forest economies of the eastern United States. Now, we have been dealing with the Endangered Species Act and its ramifications in the West for a very long time. The East has not. The meaningful reforms that passed the House that I want to stay around to get past the president and past the Senate leadership and to the president's desk would allow tribes, states, and county governments earlier participation in the listing process. We have shown in Wyoming, because of sage grouse, that we are the leaders in restoring habitat and conserving species. Other states need to catch up with us. we also need to have transparent science. In many cases, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is using proprietary science to make determinations about whether a species should be listed. If you can't see the science, you can't vet the science. It is important that we have more transparency there. And it's important that we not be paying lawyers who sue the federal government out of the very monies that are needed by those agencies to do boots on the ground conservation. And so my reforms to both the Equal Access to Justice Act, which is money spent on lawyers to sue the federal government, instead of on habitat conservation, as well as similar reforms within the Endangered Species Act, will help get more money where it's really needed to preserve species, out of the courtroom, onto the ground where we're conserving habitat. Those are two key areas where I think I can make a big difference. And I think in the next 2 years make a big difference. You know, you get on the cusp of these things where people finally start to understand them. I felt like I was talking to my own hand when I was talking about Endangered Species Act issues. And finally, with this bat, this long-eared bat, that is affecting a sweeping part of the East, Eastern people are waking up to the realities of dealing with the Endangered Species Act. The lesser prairie chicken in Texas and Oklahoma, Texas hadn't had the kinds of encounters that they're having with this act. And now people are thinking, this is important, we need to start paying attention. Who knows about this? Westerners, Western members of Congress. And so we're finally educating and helping our Eastern colleagues to get meaningful, practical reforms. These are the small steps that can finally get people on the same page. That's what I want to stay for.
Representative Lummis, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be with you. Appreciate your time. And can I just say to the voters of Wyoming, I very much appreciate your feedback and representing you in Congress. Our staff is here in Wyoming to help you with issues. We're there to respond to your concerns. We hope that you feel that we're providing you with a good service. And I very humbly ask for your support and your vote.